The next slide is an attempt by our team artist to depict what this temple probably looked like. At the time, it is a small, modest temple, but quite ornate by local standards. Probably plastered by white. It was, of course, built out of the local basalt stone. That same year that my colleague spent 3 weeks in a wine cellar, I excavated the low-rent district. The low-rent district in Bethsaida had houses that were so modest that they didn't even want to build 3 walls. This is a very small 2-room house, and it was so cheap that they used the city wall as one of the walls, and they built the walls of the 3 walls of the house attached to the city wall. It's a 2-room house, so they had the 3 walls attached to the city wall and then one dividing wall in the middle. You can see it in the upper left, the dividing wall. The rooms are about 8 by 10 feet each. 2 rooms, that's the entire house. You can see in the very bottom left a very large stone. That stone was there in the 1st century. This house was inhabited in the 1st century. We found 1st century pottery in the floor. That stone was there, so it served as a sort of couch, this very, very large stone. That stone turns out to be one of the cornerstones of a massive Iron Age temple underneath. We only discovered that very later. I made a very interesting discovery in this house, and you can see it, the picture of me holding it and a close-up picture on the right. This is a Herodian oil lamp. You might recognize this from the Herodian oil lamp that I showed you earlier, that triangular snout of an oil lamp, quite ornate. Remember that Herodian oil lamps were only made during a very short period of time, during this time of the sons of King Herod, that is precisely during Jesus' lifetime. Because this was found there, that dates this house securely to the time of Jesus. And now, of course, we can let our imaginations take hold a little bit. Did Jesus visit this house when he was in town? We don't have that many 1st century houses. Maybe. Did any of the disciples live in this house? Maybe. Did Jesus visit this house and sit on that large rock and have a conversation about the kingdom of God illuminated by that oil lamp? It's interesting that, of course, the probability is pretty good. We're not sure. We can never be sure, but that's about as close as you're ever going to get in terms of archaeology. Now to Jerusalem. The classic picture of Jerusalem standing on the Mount of Olives, looking across the Kidron Valley to what was the ancient Temple Mount in Jesus' time, now the Haram al-Sharif, the sacred mount of the 3rd holiest site in the Islamic world. You can see, of course, the golden dome of the Rock in the middle. When Jesus was in town, of course, there was a temple on that site, and around that site we had a lot of this reconstruction that had been done by Herod the Great. The temple was destroyed by Titus, if you remember, in 70 A.D. What became of that temple? Do we have anything left? Well, the answer is yes, sort of, and here's a picture. This is on the western side of the retaining wall of the Temple Mount, down on the street that Jesus would have walked on, the 1st century street, and you can see a pile of very nicely cut stone blocks. We call those ashlars. Those stone blocks, in all probability, are some of the walls of the ancient temple from Jesus' time. When the Romans came in and knocked the temple down, they basically just shoved those stones off the retaining wall and they fell down into the street, and archaeologists only found them a few years ago. Here's another view of that same pile of stones and also that 1st century street. So Jesus would have walked on this street as he was going around the Temple Mount. You can also see the retaining wall on the right and the routed edge, if you will, of these stone ashlars. This is typical of Herodian construction. So those lower, very large, very nicely cut stones date from that period of time. Most people, when they went to go to the temple in Jesus' time, probably would have entered from the south. And here's the ornate, monumental staircase that people would have climbed up to enter the temple in Jesus' time. There were openings through the walls and kind of a tunnel that allowed people to go through at the time. Those have since been blocked off. The upper walls that you're seeing here are Turkish in origin. And now we go to the holiest site in the Jewish world, the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall. Again, the lower courses of stones on this wall are of Herodian origin. They date from the 1st century, and the upper stones you can see as they get smaller and smaller are of later periods, especially Muslim and Turkish architecture. Notice, please, at the very top of this slide is the Temple Mount, which is now the Haram al-Sharif, controlled by the Waqf, the Muslim religious authority. Notice that we have a very interesting strategic problem here, because the third holiest site in the Islamic world is at the top of this picture. The holiest site in the Jewish world is at the bottom of this picture. And remember the rule of history: it is always easier to throw things down than it is to throw things up. So anybody who was able to get up to the top and throw something down that could hurt people is a frightening prospect. And so there's a very, very delicate security organization around this that is frustrating to all involved, but it's part of the nature of this part of the world. On the bottom right is a model, a very large model, built actually by an archaeologist. It is at the Holy Land Hotel, and this is a reconstruction of what one archaeologist thinks the 1st century temple looked like. On the top left is an inscription that was found around the base of the temple. This is an ancient 1st century inscription, and it says, "To the place of trumpeting." It was probably at the very top of the retaining wall of the Temple Mount, and it was the place where a person would blow a trumpet in order to summon people to Shabbat. So every Friday night when 3 stars are visible in the sky, the trumpet would be blown. On the bottom left is another piece of an inscription. It warns Gentiles not to go any farther into the temple precincts. There were signs up on the walls, and Gentiles could go into the court of Gentiles, but they could not go into the court of Israel. They could only go so far within the temple courtyards, and this is probably from that 1st century temple, a Greek inscription warning people not to go any farther, warning Gentiles not to go any farther. Here is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, probably the most sacred site in the Christian world. A commemorative site with some significant archaeological underpinnings, commemorating the place of Jesus' execution, Golgotha, and his grave. So we call the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Is this the right place? We can't be sure, but there is some interesting evidence when we go inside. Here, and there are many places where you can see sort of underneath the building. The building was built initially by Constantine at the request of his mother, Helena, when she went on her pilgrimage famously in 326. And it was built both over the site of execution and the site of the grave as identified at that time. Here you are seeing part of the hill of Golgotha as identified in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Here we see a very interesting piece of archaeological evidence that was found having to do with crucifixion in Jerusalem. People were crucified in Jerusalem. How do we know? Well, we have actually here a very interesting portrayal. This is a nail, a Roman iron nail that had been hammered through somebody's heel, and it went into the wood. It apparently hit a knot, bent, and so when it was time to remove the body from the cross, they couldn't get the nail out of the bone. So it's kind of weird and kind of stupid when you think of whoever the guard was who nailed in the nail. He drove it through a bone. That's strange by itself. And then it had to hit a knot and get bent, so you couldn't get it out. That's the only reason why we have this. It so happens then this body was buried. It was a fairly wealthy person. It was found in a grave at a place called Givat Ha-Mivtar in Jerusalem. And after the body, this is very typical, the body was desiccated, the flesh rotted off and so on. The bones were collected and put in a bone box, which we call an ossuary. The ossuary was discovered. It has a name scratched on the side. The name is Yehochanan. And we found this bone. It's the only bone we have that gives us, with a nail, gives us evidence of a specific crucifixion. The interpretation of this bone is pretty important, because does this bone, the existence of this bone with a nail through it, mean that very few people were crucified. Why do we only have one? Or that people who were crucified weren't buried very often, or they might have been buried in pit graves or something like that. Or is it just a bizarre fluke that we may have lots of bones of people who were crucified, but the guards aren't usually stupid enough to drive a nail through a bone? And therefore, of course, you're not going to see it. They're going to drive it through tendons or something like that, things that won't leave a mark afterwards, and so you wouldn't have any evidence. You could have one pile of bones and another pile of bones. One was crucified, one died of natural causes, and you wouldn't know. I suspect the latter is true, but it's hard to know. Here is the cenotaph, the shrine over the traditional site of Jesus' Holy Sepulchre, where people go to visit. Here is a first century tomb with a stone that rolls across. This, of course, isn't in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but it gives you an idea of what it would look like, since the Holy Sepulchre is very ornate. Here are some first century tombs. First century style Jewish tombs are called kokim, and these things are about 2 to 3 feet tall, and they're basically slots cut on the ground level into a stone, and you would slide the body, sort of like a morgue, into this slot and leave the body there to desiccate for about a year or something like that. And then you might collect the bones and do something with the bones thereafter. That allows one tomb to function for multiple generations. This is in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This is very important, which shows that first century Jewish tombs are in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. We call these the Joseph of Arimathea tombs, and they're just a few feet away from the shrine that represents Jesus' tomb.